have been very much, I suppose, following the Teagasc blueprint of what dairy farming is, and I would have been stocked at 2.7 livestock units per hectare, I think, in 2015, and doing essentially all that comes with that. So look, I won't go too much into where I came from and just fairly move on. So in 2015, you could say the journey started with a question, and I suppose everyone is here today because they're asking the same question, maybe questioning what we were doing and all of these things. And I suppose that's just a field from 2015. It was just a clover sward, and like I was doing my own little trials. Just actually, like on the farm as a whole, I would have been spreading 240 kilos of nitrogen, the maximum amount of nitrogen, to try and essentially maximise the amount of grass growing, aiming for 16 tonne of grass dry matter. And I skipped parts of that and didn't do it, and I didn't seem to see any difference in the amount of grass that was growing on it. And I suppose at the same year, actually, that slide, or that little table at the bottom, was from the Moore Park 2015 Open Day. And it's essentially just detailing plot trials that were conducted over 4 years. And you can see the grass clover combination was out yielding grass only on all different nitrogen treatments. And you can actually also see that there was actually a negative growth response to nitrogen up to 120 kilos of nitrogen per hectare on the grass clover. You could say there was still a negative economic response to nitrogen at 196, and just pretty much a marginal economic response at 240 kilos of nitrogen. And I suppose a lot of questions could stem from that as to what we're doing in the industry as a whole, and even in trial work. But I suppose at the same time, I was reading books by Frank Newman-Turner, actually, 2 brilliant books, Fertility Farming and Fertility Pastures. And so I didn't really dwell too long, I suppose, on that whole clover question, because it brought me on to, I think, a much bigger question, and that's diversity. And so I suppose Joel Williams mentioned yesterday, one of the first things is to design with diversity, and I suppose that really was the theme of Newman-Turner's books. And yeah, I completely resonated with it. I suppose the big question that comes from this is, can a diversity of plants feed a diversity of microorganisms in the soil that can in turn then release all the different minerals that we're essentially looking much far beyond nitrogen, what we tend to associate with clover mostly, but actually looking at all the different minerals, the P and Ks. The lady up the front asked about copper earlier on, and there's plantain there that's going to have 3 times the level of copper as your ordinary grass, any of the grasses. If I look at my soil reports, I'm deficient in copper. If I look at my forage reports for silage over the years, they're deficient in copper. If I look at my red clover silage, it's actually not deficient in copper. So these different plants are actually able to access all these different minerals. And so we actually often mightn't have a copper deficiency at all. It's just from years and years of maybe lack of diversity that's cycling all these minerals that are actually there in the soil, and that we can utilize them. So yeah, a huge lot of questions, I suppose, come from diversity. So Frank Newman-Turner, he was back in the 1940s and 50s doing these, and so he was growing these essentially to increase carbon in the soil. And we talked a lot about this yesterday, and obviously there's a huge imperative on us now that we have to increase carbon in the soil. And for me, that is the big function of these. It's there. Even go back 120 years to the Clifton Park project, and that's where he was doing that for the same reason. It's not new science or anything like that. It's essentially just embracing what makes sense. I know, again, in discussion yesterday, and maybe John Garrity might be able to shed more light on it, but I suppose my understanding actually was that so soil carbon is not actually included in a lot of the climate change, to offset carbon, but if we actually change our practices as regards to how we manage the soil, well, then it actually can be allowed. So maybe that can be answered later. But and so actually, if we were to, as an industry, to embrace maybe multi-species swards or diversity, we could actually and then show results of carbon increasing with that, we could embrace, or that could be allowed. So I suppose another big kind of, I suppose, mindset change that came at around the same time was concept of a weed, I suppose, and what we think are weeds in our pastures. And I can remember being at a discussion group meeting back in 2015, and a big kind of discussion entailed around dandelion and how this was terrible terror of a plant creating havoc, and we needed to spray it out of existence and all the rest. And again, I've never seen dairy cows not to essentially love dandelion, and again it's much richer in minerals and copper again. And I suppose I think at that time I kind of very much resonated with the idea that weeds are actually, they're messengers telling us, what's actually wrong in the soil, and more than that, they're actually trying to fix what's wrong in the soil. And so I suppose you could pretty much say overnight that all weeds disappeared on my farm in 2015. Other than this guy here, you might recognize it. So he's just actually included in the sward, just so I can actually not feel left out and say I have weeds on my farm. So yeah, that's. I suppose I moved on quickly then to holistic grazing. So again, this was discussed a lot today and yesterday, and I suppose there's question marks over its application to dairy farms. So my first introduction to this concept was actually from Clive Bright back in 2015 when he spoke about it at a sales conference in Clare, Galway. And again, that brought up a lot of questions in my head, because you could say the previous 10 years I was practicing golf ball grazing down to 3.5 centimetres or at least below 4 centimetres, and keeping residuals down that low to maximise grass utilisation. And I suppose that's pretty much, the big drive of grass in Ireland is, you could say it's based on two principles, and that's maximising utilisation and also maximising quality, where we measure quality simply in terms of megajoules of metabolisable energy. And so, we're striving for 13 ME grass, and so yeah, of course that's a very narrow parameter to measure quality. So I suppose in maximising utilisation, in theory we're minimising what we're returning to the soil, and you can kind of see that mindset is that there's nothing really, the biology in the soil isn't really worth feeding, so we don't have any emphasis on that. And so yeah, I definitely thought this was worth trialing, and thought it definitely had a lot of merits, and yeah, we're not put off by it from a dairy heart. So you can see this is a picture from earlier on this year, and it's quite interesting. You can see there's some quite strong grass in it. It's a herbal mix. But there's an understory, you could say, of quite lush clovers and chicory and plantain and more vegetative grasses, and then there's some grasses that are gone to seed head. And actually it's very interesting to look at how the cows reacted. So the first thing, they went in and they actually start going around munching all the seed heads of the cocksfoot grass, and so you could, after an hour or two, it was just an area of decapitated cocksfoot, before they then started to move in and took into the more lush understory. So yeah, I think I suppose the big, Clive discussed it earlier too, I suppose the big theory behind mob grazing, I suppose you're trying to, because you have longer rotations, and them longer rotations are trying to, in having that longer rotation, you're growing more grass, and that extra grass you're growing is going to offset the extra grass you're not utilising by the animals, or that you're returning to the soil. So that actually hasn't happened in my situation, but that's, I suppose it's been combined in with the fact that I'm still this is my third year of conversion, going from full allocation of nitrogen to zero nitrogen, so there's a bit of a withdrawal period, I assume, in that. And then also, the soil doesn't necessarily have this digestive capacity, it just doesn't develop it overnight. And all that extra carbon going into the soil is now competing for nitrogen, and of course it's going to bring drawbacks. But for me, it's still worth trialing, and I really wanted to give it a shot. I suppose the other big thing, actually, I know around that time too, Dave Beecher and myself, we went around the farm digging holes and looking at the root depths and different things. And I know a lot of talk has went on this conference too about, that maybe Irish soils are relatively better. But I think when we often dig a hole, we might see a very different situation, that maybe in our climate, soil degradation, it's not like in other countries where they have desertification, but we have this kind of degradation from the bottom up. And like I know on my farm, on that field there, for instance, there's potential for deep soils. You could see after 30 centimeters where essentially nothing was going on. But in that top 30 centimeters, of course, it had found its balance. Even with high nitrogen, there was labile carbon. It's all just cycling there, and it could be cycling at a very rapid rate because of all the nitrogen being used. But then below that, essentially nothing was happening because there was no root exits. And even already in the period, I can see roots going deeper. I can see more life coming into the soil. Earthworm counts are increasing. So I think the early signs definitely of improvement are there. And again, I know there was, I think earlier this year, or it could have been last year, I think Teagasc, they done a study on just looking at the potential for carbon sequestration in Irish soils, and they published a little map. And essentially the conclusion was that like a lot of there was very little potential for extra carbon sequestration in Irish soils, and particularly in the areas of most intensive, probably the best soils in Ireland, where like in my mind at the time I couldn't believe it when I read it. I think it's quite the opposite. They're the areas that have the most potential if we change our practices. So I'll skip on to animal health, and yet this is definitely a big one. So I suppose the big change that came with animal health is a big mindset change in that as a conventional farmer we very much treat health as freedom from disease, and as a biological farmer you're very much looking at health as resilience to disease. And the difference that makes is pretty massive. So just even if we were to, at this time of year, of course, a lot of dairy farmers are about to dry off cows. And so standard practice is obviously to use an antibiotic dry cow tube. And even if you ignore all the resistance issues and everything else, if you're to actually follow that through, so you'll dry your cow off, next February she's going to calve down, and she calves down and the calf sucks her, you feed her 3 or 4 litres of colostrum, and of course there's antibiotics in that, and it's not insignificant. So any farmer who makes yogurt or different things like this to feed calves will see that will pretty much bring an end to yogurt if it gets in. So that has to be separated out. So it's what's that doing in the calf's stomach? Of course, this is a stage where a lot of this kind of microflora and all this microbiology in the stomach is getting established as well. And then a few weeks later we could run into calf scour issues and rotavirus and cryptosporidia and all of these different things. And then we have to go and vaccinate for rotavirus, and we have to use different products for crypto every day for whatever number of days, and all of these other issues that we don't necessarily link back to maybe something simple like the dry cow tube. Or I know a guy yesterday spoke about Crohn's disease, and like that's a big one. Johne's disease is often a very comparable disease in dairy cows. And again, what is it? It's like, I know there's a lot of research showing that early exposure to antibiotics can have a big impact on Crohn's disease, and in upsetting that kind of gut microflora. And are we asking these questions with Johne's disease? And then obviously, a big part of the Johne's disease control program is transitioning over to milk replacer. Again, like a sterile product that is actually going to have a negative effect on the gut microflora and the rumen microflora and all of these things. So another very interesting thing that came out on animal health earlier this year, was research by Teagasc, was on vitamin D levels. And so vitamin D levels in dairy calves, they found was taken up to 4 months before they were getting to the optimum levels. And obviously vitamin D is, like all of these things, are tied hugely into immunity. And one of the speculations was maybe indoor calving was having an effect on this. But I think there's so many, and then the follow-on to that is that we need to look at more supplementation, maybe in the dairy calf or in the cow at this stage of lactation. But for me, there's much bigger questions on this that aren't being asked. So I know glyphosate was mentioned a few times today, and Gary mentioned it as it's a known chelator of minerals, so like zinc and selenium and copper, and these ones that are already deficient in our diets are getting tied up even more. But it's also shown to actually inhibit the enzyme that actually releases or makes vitamin D3 available. And again, but is that question being asked? I don't really think it is. But I think Robbie put up the iceberg, yesterday, showing the hidden effects of disease, and we often see this, from pharmaceutical perspective of why we need to control disease, but we don't really see this from maybe the side effects of something like glyphosate or other practices, even maybe antibiotics, the knock-on effects that we're having. Again, I think Animal Health Ireland is kind of the body now tasked with challenging or with get ridding Ireland, I suppose, aiming for that, I suppose, freedom from disease. I think 2019 they have earmarked to start an IBR eradication program, and this is kind of going to be very much based on the programs that have already been rolled out in Holland and Belgium, which is essentially a double vaccination program. And it's again, I think there's a lot of questions need to be asked about this kind of approach. Are we going to look? I can see how there's going to be a huge drive for this to happen, because we're going to be easily told, okay, well, if we want we're a big export country. If we want access to export markets, we need to show we have this IBR control program in place. If we want to be able to live export, we're going to have this in place. So there's going to be massive pressure, and it's going to be very much that the model of Animal Health Ireland is farmer participation. So it's presented as a farmer-driven model, but again, farmers, we're all out of our comfort zone in dealing with disease, because we're not microbiologists, we're not virologists, or whatever it is. But what we should be about is about health, and maybe it's time we should actually start developing and focusing on health rather than actually focusing on disease. So from cow to grass to soil, yeah. So that's actually my son Paddy on that cow's back. So 2 minutes or 20 seconds after that photo was taken, he actually landed on his back. So luckily there was a nice soft cushion of grass for him to fall on. But yeah, so I suppose when I finished college and started farming, there was it was a kind of a transitional period from very much a cow output focused system to a more grass output focused system. And that kind of came with a transition. We had the old RBI system, which was very much focused on litres or volume of milk. And we transitioned, and getting that, I suppose, largely from feeding high volumes of concentrates. And then we shifted to a grass-focused system where, now we're looking at, and it also came with a slightly more holistic view of, we're looking at much more protein and butterfat in the milk, combined with looking at how much grass we're growing, but really trying to get that by spreading as much fertilizer as possible. And so for me, I suppose, biological farming is now much more soil focused, but also, I suppose, the interaction of all three of them, cow, grass and soil. And I suppose in that, the whole idea of productivity comes into play, and I suppose what productivity is defined as output per unit input. So really, to understand productivity, I suppose we have to look a bit more at inputs and outputs. So if we look at inputs, so again, that's this slide just reminds me of, there's an old Dutch saying apparently that fertilizer is good for the father and bad for the son. So I think this little guy might have twisted my arm and told me to stop spreading fertilizer. But so inputs, I suppose, if 18612 was a commonly used fertilizer. I'm glad to say I'm not 100% sure what the price of a ton of 18612, but just say maybe it's around €350. And so I suppose where that as comes up as an input on our profit monitor or wherever else is that €350. But of course we know there's a much bigger cost to that 18612. So I know Joel mentioned yesterday about losses of nitrogen, but actually James Humphreys of Teagasc earlier this year in the journal had a thing, and actually he put nitrogen efficiency rates in a typical Irish dairy farm at 30%. So that was even, I think, lower than the rates Joel Williams had. So there's, of course, that 70% that is getting lost to waterways and to the airways. That's obviously having a huge cost that affects us all. It mightn't show on our profit monitor, but it's a real cost. You could say I learnt also first-hand experience of the potassium side. So in I suppose my last year before converting to organic, so 2015. So this following spring of 2016, when I was feeding 2015 silage, I ran into a very large milk fever problem in my dairy cows. I suppose at the time I wasn't sure, so the normal response of try feed more magnesium, whatever else. None of that was working. Even actually it was a slightly different form of milk fever and wasn't even responding to calcium. So I think 15% of the herd actually in that period were actually going down with milk fever, and I was actually going out with one of them hip clamps, lifting cows out to the field, and essentially they were staying down for a week, not getting up before they eventually would get up. And it was like obviously a stressful period when I was, I think, calving over 100 cows at the time, and they're all calved obviously in a quite an intense, in a 6-week period. So there was a lot of cows calving, so there was a decent number. So every day there could have been an extra cow going out. So it was not what you wanted to be dealing about. But eventually, I changed the silage. And fed a different batch of silage I had. And all of a sudden, all the problems went away. And again, it was down to potassium in the silage, excess potassium in the silage. And of course, that potassium, that silage was still fed. Now it was fed to milkers. And of course, if it was having them metabolic effects on the cows, it was obviously having a metabolic effect on the milkers too, but maybe it wasn't showing up as a bigger problem. But of course, what effect was that having on the milk that's been produced that is now being sold on to into the human food chain and on the people who are drinking it? Of course, we can probably only fool ourselves to think it's not having some negative effect. So I suppose input is much more. There's much more to it than simply what just gets measured on the profit monitor. So the inputs, I suppose, I'm not adverse to all inputs, of course. I suppose the main inputs I've had in the last few years, I suppose the biggest one you could say is actually, I suppose, what we're doing on the farm. So and our management, the management. So I think most of the problems we have are actually management problems, and so by changing management, is that 90% of what we need to do. But I suppose also I have done some soil mineralization. So last year was a relatively good financial year. So and I spread the whole farm with actually 10 ton to the hectare of basalt dust, which is essentially just a volcanic rock dust that has a very broad spectrum of minerals. I have actually addressed cobalt to a certain extent prior to even organic conversion, because I had seen vitamin B12. Every year I would see one cow maybe show up with vitamin B12, kind of going blind, and she'd recover really quickly from a vitamin B12 injection. And so I did actually spread some cobalt sulfate, and have done a little bit more of that since. I have also spread boron across the farm, and done a few small bits of calcium magnesium balancing, because most of my ratios have been very close to optimal, so it's just been a few minor tweaks on that. If we move to output, so I suppose, I think when I think of this, I suppose a book by Vandana Shiva comes to mind, The Monoculture of the Mind. I think that's a very telling statement or expression, and I think it's very kind of valid to how we view output. So I suppose, we're trained as a dairy farmer, we look at output in either maybe volume of milk or kilos of milk solids per hectare, or 16, or how many kilos of dry matter per hectare you're growing, or these kind of parameters. But obviously there's so much more output, or so much broader way of looking at it, or more holistic way of looking at it. So obviously carbon in the soil is becoming a big thing, and a lot of talk is trying to put a value on that, and obviously it has a value to farmers without any other incentive being put on it. But also obviously the whole, that report released in the last week about decline in bird numbers, decline in essentially all diversity and wildlife, and all of them of course have a huge value to us, and we can't, we ignore them at our peril. So they're all part of the spectrum. But also I suppose if we actually look at then the milk we're producing and quality, so and again this came up yesterday, but so okay, we have this, what comes to my mind on this, I suppose, if we look at wheat, for instance, over the last 100 years, and so okay, we might have driven wheat yields up massively, but we've also driven gluten content of wheat up 10 times in that process, and because obviously we weren't necessarily paying attention to gluten content. But again, there's a big drive to drive protein and butterfat in Ireland, but we're not really questioning, the quality of protein and butterfat. And we know all protein and butterfat aren't the same quality. So the whole A2 protein is time's up. Okay. Yeah, no problem. Sure. Look, I'll just skip through to the. You can cover some of these things in the question, but the end of my talk is essentially all of these questions. Look, everyone's coming from a different point of view on this, and for me, it's essentially combining asking questions first of all, and asking maybe the uncomfortable questions that we often don't want to deal with, and then it's essentially follow your own intuition, because I think this is where a lot of the problems we're in today is we've been looking to Teagasc and we've been looking to whoever for advice, and but essentially it's about us empowering ourselves. For too long, I suppose a really good statement I've heard is it's treat the pathway to, or the seeking truth more like gossip than gospel. So everything you hear, don't necessarily believe any of it, but then take what you feel resonates with you. And I know just in the last month in Ireland, we had a vote on our constitution, taking blasphemy out of it, I suppose. And what is really blasphemy about, I suppose, it was to stifle any questioning of religion. But we could kind of see this coming into science now, so people don't want us to question science, don't want to, trust the science has been very much shouted about glyphosate and about all of these things. So I think it's, we don't want to go there again. I think it's time to ask a lot more questions. Okay, thank you.